It was 1:40 in the morning when I heard my wife laughing in the sunroom.
At 1:40 in the morning,
not her regular
this
laugh.
was the only
a different
window
one.
still burning.
Younger, easier. I stood in my own hallway,
I
in my
remember
bare
that
feet.
door.
On the floor I laid myself, and I listened to her say,
It was
"He still
always
cries in the
closed."
shower." Honestly, it's the easiest money we've ever made.
Every step must
Then
be
she
silent.
said, "Love you too." And she wasn't talking
The
to me.
darkness
See?
holds its breath.
3 years earlier, she'd started handing me a little white pill every night at 9 o'clock to help me sleep, she said, to take the edge off. What she didn't know was that
I
I'd
still
stopped
remember
swallowing
those
it.
long
Let me back up.
conversations.
Because
the way her
if I just
laughter
start there,
filled
you'll
the
think I was a
entire
fool.
room.
And maybe I was.
Even through the thick.
But I want you to understand how a
9
man
o'clock.
gets there. How a reasonable, careful, hardworking man ends up standing
Just
in his
like
own
every other
hallway
night.
at 1 in the morning, finding out that his entire life was somebody else's business plan. My name is Ray Callahan. I'm 65 years old. I live in Marlow, Ohio, about 40 minutes outside Columbus, the kind of town where the same guy has cut the grass at the ball field for 30 years and nobody's ever paid him for it. I started Callahan Heating and Air in 1989 with a used panel van, a borrowed set of gauges, and $1,100 I didn't really have. For the first 2 years, I did my own invoices at the kitchen table after midnight. I crawled through attics in August. I lay on my back under people's houses in February with ice water dripping on my face. I built that company one furnace at a time. And I didn't do it alone. Diane and I got married in 1985. She was 22. I was 24, and I had no business asking her. She said yes anyway. She answered the phone for the business out of our spare bedroom for 11 years before we could afford an actual office. She knew every customer's name and every customer's dog's name. And she had this habit. You know how some people have that one thing that's just theirs? Diane wrote her grocery lists on the backs of envelopes. Junk mail, electric bill, didn't matter. There were envelopes with her handwriting stuffed in every drawer in that house. We had 2 kids, Nathan first, then Aaron, 2.5 years behind him. In '94, we bought a little cabin up at Kettle Lake for $41,000, which at the time felt like we'd lost our minds. That cabin raised those kids more than we did. Nathan learned to drive a boat there. Aaron got her first stitches off the dock there. 34 years. That's what we had. In 2018, I sold the business to a regional outfit and I told Diane, "That's it. We're done. Let's go be old people." 6 months later, she got the diagnosis. I'm not going to spend a lot of your time on that part, because if you've been through it, you already know, and if you haven't, I'd rather you didn't. I'll just say this. I was there for all of it, every appointment, every scan. I learned the names of drugs I couldn't pronounce. And near the end, when she couldn't sit up anymore, she'd still ask me what the weather was doing outside, because she liked to know. She died in March of 2019. I wrote her obituary myself. Sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad at 3 in the morning and tried to fit 34 years into 400 words. I remember thinking, this is the last thing I'll ever write about her, and I wanted to get it right. Remember that. The obituary. I need you to remember that I wrote it. The year after was, there's no good word. The house got loud. That's the thing nobody warned you about. An empty house is the loudest place on earth. I'd be sitting in the recliner at 4 in the afternoon and the refrigerator would kick on and I'd about come out of my skin. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped going to the diner where we had breakfast every Saturday for 20 years because the waitress would look at me with that face. I lost 22 pounds without trying. Nathan came by and mowed my lawn without asking. Erin, she's a nurse, my daughter. She was 30 then. She started calling every single night at 7 o'clock, and I know it wasn't because she had something to say. It was so she'd know I picked up. And my oldest friend, Walt Deacon, showed up in my driveway one Saturday with 2 folding chairs and a cooler and sat there with me for 4 hours without saying more than 9 words. Walt did 30 years with the sheriff's department. He fixes lawnmowers in his garage now, mostly for free. He's the kind of man who doesn't fill silence just because it's there. It was Aaron who found the grief group. Wednesday nights, 7 o'clock, in the basement of St. Brendan's. Folding chairs, bad coffee and styrofoam, a card table with a plate of store-bought cookies nobody ever touched. I went so my daughter would stop worrying. That's the only reason. I sat in the back row for 3 weeks and didn't say a word. The second Wednesday of October 2019, a woman sat down next to me. She had a cardigan the color of oatmeal, and she smelled like something clean and simple. And when the facilitator asked if anyone new wanted to share, she said her name was Corinne and that she'd lost her husband Doyle and that she wasn't ready to talk about it yet. Thank you. And that was it. She just sat there. Afterward, in the parking lot, she was scraping frost off her windshield with a credit card because she'd lost her scraper. So I gave her mine. That's how it started. A $3 ice scraper. She said, You're Ray, right? 34 years. And I said, yeah. And I got in my truck and drove home and thought absolutely nothing about it. Look, I want to be honest with you here because this is the part where people judge. I want you to know that I did not want a new wife. I wasn't lonely in that way. I was 58 years old and I fully expected to die in that house by myself, and I'd made my peace with it. But Corinne was easy. She never once told me it would get better. She never said Diane was in a better place. She'd just say things like, yeah, it's Tuesday. Tuesdays are bad. She started saving me a seat. Then we started getting coffee after. Then it was dinner. And somewhere in there, and I couldn't tell you the day, I laughed at something out loud, a real one, from the belly, and it startled me so bad I had to pull the truck over. 18 months later, in August of 2021, we got married in my backyard. 26 people. Aaron made the cake. Nathan gave a toast that was mostly about me, not her, and I saw Corinne's smile go a little tight, but I figured, well, that's grown kids. And here's the part that's hardest to say out loud. The first year was good. It really was. She learned how I take my coffee. She put a bird feeder outside the kitchen window because she noticed I looked out there in the mornings. She'd rub my shoulder when I walked past the recliner. I woke up one morning, that first spring, and Diane wasn't the first thing I thought of, and I laid there and cried about it. And Corinne held on to me and didn't say a word, which was exactly the right thing. I trusted that woman completely. There were two things. Just two in that whole first year, and I want you to hold on to them. The first was a blue plastic tote. It was the only thing she brought into that marriage that never got unpacked. It went straight down into the crawl space onto the stairs, and when I asked her about it, she got quiet and said, "That's Doyle's things. I'm not ready." So I never touched it. Of course I didn't. What kind of man would? The second was the garage. She took her phone calls in the garage, always. Rain, snow, didn't matter. She'd look at the screen, and she'd get up, and she'd go out and pull the door shut behind her. And if I asked, she'd say, "Just my brother Dale. He's in one of his moods." I met Dale exactly once, 4th of July, 2022. Big guy, easy handshake, laughed at everything I said. I took a picture that day of the whole crowd by the garage. I didn't look at that picture again for 3 years, and when I finally did, I saw where his hand was. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before any of that, in the fall of 2022, my phone rang at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. It was Walt, and his voice was wrong. He said, "Ray, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not get mad at me." I said, "Then don't tell me something that'll make me mad." He didn't laugh. Walt always laughs. That's when I knew. He said, "I ran her." I stood there in my own kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I said, "You ran who?" "Corinne." I ran her name. And I remember I looked out the window over the sink at nothing, and I said, very slowly, "You ran a background check on my wife." "On your fiancé," he said, June of 21, 2 months before the wedding. That's the part that got me. Not that he did it. That he'd been sitting on it for over a year, watching me be happy, deciding every single day not to say it. And now, all of a sudden, he changed his mind. He said, "Doyle Ranney, her husband, he died in December of 2011, Ray." I said, "Okay." 2011. She told that whole room he'd been gone 14 months. And you know what I did? I defended her, instantly, without thinking about it for 1 second. I said, "Walt, grief doesn't have a calendar. You lose somebody, and it's 14 months forever. That's not a lie. That's just how it feels." Silence on the line. Then he said, "The obituary lists a wife." "Yeah, her." "No," he said, "Sheila." And I want to tell you that a cold hand went down my back, that I sat down, that some part of me knew. It didn't. It really didn't, I said. "So he was married before." "So she's the second wife." So the family wrote the notice and left her out because families do that, Walt. Families are ugly about that stuff. "There's no license," he said. "Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana." I can't find a marriage record for Corinne and Doyle Ranney anywhere I can still reach. And that's when they got mean. I'm 65 years old, and I have said maybe 4 things in my life I'd give real money to take back, and this was one of them. I said, "You know what your problem is? You spent 30 years turning over rocks, and now everything in the world looks like a rock to you. You can't just let a man be happy." You couldn't stand it. And Walt, who sat in my driveway for 4 hours in the worst week of my life and didn't say 9 words, Walt said, quiet as anything, "All right, Ray." I said, "My wife is asleep upstairs. Don't call me for a while." And I hung up on my oldest friend. Then I walked through my dark house to the stairs. and I saw light coming under the door to the garage. She wasn't asleep upstairs, she was out there, at 9:40 on a Thursday night. And I stood at that door with my hand flat on the wood, and I did not open it. Because I'd just called a good man paranoid for asking a question, and I'd have died before I asked it myself. When she came in, she smelled like cold air. She said, "Who was on the phone?" I said, "Walt." And her whole face went soft, and she said, "Oh, is he all right?" See, that's the thing. That's what nobody understands about people like her. She never attacked. Not once. In 4 years, I never heard that woman say one cruel word about anybody. Over the next few months, she just worried. Out loud. Gently. "I just don't love how quiet you get after you talk to him. I think he likes you better when you're sad, honey. I don't think he means it." And I'd nod, and Walt's name came up less, and then it didn't come up, and I never made a decision. Not one, not ever. That's the part I still can't get my head around. There was never a moment where I chose to lose my best friend. He just got quieter, and then he was gone. Hold on. Let me stop for 1 second. If this is starting to get under your skin the way it should, do me a favor. Subscribe, leave a like, and tap that bell so the next story finds you on its own. That's it. Now let me tell you about Thanksgiving, November 2022, Nathan's house. First one we'd done there, and she was wonderful. Brought 2 pies. Sat on the floor with my grandson Cole and his Legos for 40 minutes in a nice dress. Complimented Jess's table. Laughed at Nathan's stupid story about the roofer. Then in the kitchen, scraping plates, she leaned in and touched my arm and said, real low, real kind, "Don't take it personal, Ray. He's just protective of his mom's memory. It's sweet, honestly." And I said, "What?" Nathan didn't say anything. And she said, and smiled and turned on the faucet. That's it. That's the whole thing. 9 words. But I sat at that table for the next hour and a half and I studied my son. Every time he laughed, I wondered what he really meant. Every time he didn't look at me, I heard her voice. I drove home in silence and I was hurt, genuinely hurt, by something that had never happened. She did it in both directions. I didn't find that out for 3 more years. April 2023. My granddaughter Maddie turned 6. I missed it. Not late. Missed it. Whole party. I called Erin the next morning to apologize and I was fumbling, saying I never got the invite, and my daughter went very quiet on the phone. Then she said, "Dad, Corinne told me you weren't feeling up to it." I said, "Feeling up to it? Erin, I've never been sick a day in my..." And she said you get overwhelmed with the noise now. She said not to make a thing of it. I hung up and I walked out to the garage where Corinne was going through a box and I asked her. And she looked up at me with these big open eyes and said, "Honey, it's on the calendar. We talked about it Tuesday. You said your back was bothering you." And I went and looked at the calendar and there it was, her handwriting. Maddie, 2 p.m. And there was a little line through it. I couldn't remember Tuesday. I couldn't remember any of it. That was the spring the sleeping started to go bad. Real bad. 2-3 hours a night, and the rest of it just laying there in the dark, doing arithmetic on my own life. I got short with people. I forgot a dentist appointment. I put the milk in the pantry and found it 2 days later. And one night, May, I think, she came and sat on the edge of the bed at 2 in the morning and she rubbed my back and she said, "Ray, you can't keep doing this to yourself." She had a little amber bottle in her hand. She said, "It's mine. My doctor gave them to me after Doyle, half of one. That's all, just so your brain will let go for a few hours. And listen, I want you to hear me. I'm not a pill guy. I never was. I did 4 decades of crawl spaces in attics on Advil and coffee, but I hadn't slept in 9 weeks. And this woman was sitting on my bed at 2 in the morning being kind to me, so I took it. And you know what? It worked. God help me, it worked. I slept 9 hours. I woke up and the light was all the way through the window and I felt like a man who'd been let out of a cage. So it became a thing. 9 o'clock, little white pill on the counter next to a glass of water, waiting for me, every night like clockwork. She never had to say anything. It was just there. Same as the bird feeder, same as the coffee. And here's what a year of that does to a man. The mornings got later. 10. Then 11. Then I quit knowing what day it was without checking the phone. Conversations started coming back to me in pieces, like somebody handed me a photograph of something I was supposed to have been at. I'd walk into a room and just stand there. And Corinne would find me and she'd take my hand and she'd say the gentlest thing you ever heard. "It's okay, honey. It's okay. I'm right here. I'll remember for both of us." And I let her. Which brings me to a Saturday in September of 2023. I came out of the recliner at 11:15 in the morning with my mouth full of cotton, and there was a man sitting at my kitchen table, gray suit, briefcase open. Papers fanned out across the wood like a card game. He stood up and shook my hand and said it was good to finally meet me. And Corinne put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Ray, honey, we talked about this Tuesday, remember?" I looked down at the table. There were 3 pages already signed. And in the little box at the bottom of every one of them was my name, my handwriting. My signature, the same one I'd put on 40 years of invoices. And I have no memory, none, not 1 second of it, of ever picking up that pen. Here's the thing about that moment I've never been able to explain to anybody. There was a stranger in my kitchen, and I'm a man who ran a company. 19 people on payroll at the peak. I have stood in a stranger's basement at 11 o'clock at night and told him his heat exchanger was cracked and his family had to get out of the house. And I said it calm, because that's the job. So when he slid the 4th page across my table and set the pen on top of it and said, "And this is just the healthcare piece, Mr. Callahan." Same as we discussed, I did not say I don't remember discussing anything. I did not say what is this. I did not say there is something wrong with my head. I picked up the pen, and I signed it, and then I signed the 5th one, and the 6th, and the 7th, because a man does not admit to a stranger in a gray suit that he's lost. He just doesn't. You can call that pride, you can call it stupid. I've had a long time to sit with it, and I'd call it both. His name was Curtis Boyd. Boyd and Sturm, out of Columbus. 50-something, soft handshake, kind of a laugh he used as punctuation. And I want to be fair to the man. I don't believe he knew. I've thought about it for years. I think he saw an older gentleman and his attentive wife and a routine morning's work. There was one moment. He was squaring the pages on the table and he said, sort of offhand, "Now, we went with immediate rather than springing, so we won't need a physician's letter. Cleaner that way." And I said, I didn't know what those words meant. Springing, immediate, sounded like plumbing. Here's what it meant. A springing power of attorney doesn't wake up until 2 doctors sign a paper saying you can't run your own life anymore. An immediate one is awake the second the ink dries. I had just handed my wife the legal authority to be me, at my own kitchen table, over coffee I don't remember pouring. Boyd shook my hand and said what a pleasure it was, and the storm door banged, and then it was just the 2 of us. And Corinne, God, I can still see it. She came around behind my chair and put both arms around my neck and pressed her cheek against my head and said, "You did so good, honey. You did so good," like I was a kid who sat still at the dentist. Then she made me a grilled cheese. Cut it corner to corner, the way I like it. And I sat there and ate it, and I felt proud of myself. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I felt proud. 2 days later, I went looking for those papers, just to read them. And they weren't in the desk, and they weren't in the file cabinet, and when I asked, she didn't even look up from the sink. She said, "Curtis keeps the originals, hon. That's what you pay him for." And I said, "Right." And I never thought about it again. That's the pill. That's exactly how it worked. A question would come into my head, and I'd get about halfway across, and then I'd just sit down and go to sleep. Now let me tell you about the doctors. 2024, I'm at my regular 6-month with Dr. Prewitt, a fella I've been going to since Bush was president, and he asks me how I'm sleeping, and before I get a syllable out, Corinne says, "Better. He's doing much better. He's been a little forgetful, but I think that's just age." And Prewitt nods and types. And here's the part that took me 2 more years to understand. He didn't look at me again. Not for the rest of the visit. Every question he asked toward my chair, but his eyes went to hers. She'd answer, and he'd nod, and he'd type. The day a doctor stops looking at you and starts looking at your wife, that's the day you quit being a person. I stopped driving at night that year. Then I just stopped driving. She'd say, "Why would you? I'm going anyway." And she was right. She was always right. It was always easier. Quick breath here. If this is getting its hooks in you, take 2 seconds, subscribe, hit like, and turn that bell on so the next one comes and finds you. All right. May of 2024, the cabin. Every year since Nathan was 9 years old, first Saturday of May, we opened up Kettle Lake. Pulled the shutters, ran the water lines, killed the wasps in the eaves. It was never a plan. Nobody called anybody, you just went. So Nathan loaded up coal and 2 rods and drove 2 hours north on the first Saturday in May. And the key didn't turn. There was a lockbox on the door. He called me from the dock, and I could hear the water behind him, and my son said, "Dad, who put a lockbox on Mom's cabin?" And I said, "It's my cabin." 4 words. That's all it took. He said, Dad, that's not what I meant. I'm asking who." And I said, "You couldn't wait, could you?" Silence, long enough that I heard a boat go by. Then he said, very carefully, "Wait for what, Dad? And here's where I want to stop and ask you something." because I've asked myself this 1,000 times. If somebody you loved, somebody you trusted with everything you had left, had spent 2 years quietly telling you your own children were counting your breaths, and you were 300 nights into a fog you didn't know you were in, what would you have said next? I'll tell you what I said. I said, wait for me to die so you can sell it. And my son, who learned to drive a boat off that dock, who I taught to gap a spark plug in that gravel driveway. My son didn't yell. He just said, okay, and hung up. I didn't hear his voice again for a long, long time. And when I came into the kitchen, Corinne was already there. And she put her hand flat on my chest and she said, oh, honey, I told you not to call him. I never told her I called him. Then it was Aaron's turn. She started coming by without warning, which Corinne hated. She never said so, but the temperature in that house would drop about 10 degrees the second Aaron's car hit the driveway. And one afternoon in August, my daughter picked that amber bottle up off the counter and turned it toward the window and read it. I watched her face change. I watched a nurse of 11 years read a label and go somewhere in her head. She said, whose is this? And Corinne came around the corner drying her hands and said, light as air. Oh, that's mine, sweetheart. Don't worry, he's not taking it. It just lives there. It just lives there. Erin walked me out to her car, stood there with her keys in her fist, and she said, Dad, that's not a sleep aid. And 2 weeks before, Corinne had mentioned, real casual, real worried, that Erin had been asking her about getting me evaluated. Evaluated. You know what that word does to a man in a fog. It doesn't mean help. It means declared. It means somebody wants a doctor to sign a piece of paper that turns you into furniture. So my daughter stood in my driveway and said the bravest, kindest thing anybody said to me in 4 years. She said, I want you to see someone. Not her doctor. Ours. I'll drive you. I'll sit in the room, and I looked at the woman who called me every single night at 7 o'clock for a year so she'd know I picked up the phone, and I said, your mother would be ashamed of you. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She said, okay, Dad. 2 people. 2 people who loved me stood right in front of me, and both of them said the same little broken word. Okay. You want to know what betrayal actually sounds like? It doesn't sound like yelling. It sounds like the people who love you running out of ways to reach you, and finally just saying, okay. That was August of 2024. By Christmas, nobody came. Corinne cooked a ham. A whole ham for 2 people in a house with a dining room table that seats 10. She tied a little red bow on the bird feeder outside the kitchen window. She said, it's nice like this, isn't it? Just quiet. And I said yes, because it was quiet. It was so quiet I could hear the clock out in the hallway. I'd tell you what that whole year was like, but I don't have good words for it. So I'll just tell you what I did with my days. I got up around 10:30. I sat in the chair. I looked out the window. At some point, there was a sandwich. At some point, it got dark. And at 9 o'clock, there was a little white pill on the counter next to a glass of water. And then it was 10:30 in the morning again. That was it. That was my life. 36 years of getting up at 5 and crawling through other people's attics, and it came down to a chair by a window and a pill on a counter. I was 64 years old, and I had become furniture. Then, September of 2025. A Wednesday. Corinne came into the kitchen with her phone in her hand and that little worried crease she'd get, and she said Dale had thrown his back out and there was nobody up there to help him. Could she go for a few days? 4 days. She made me 2 casseroles and wrote the microwave times on the foil with a Sharpie. She kissed the top of my head, and she left, and she took her purse, and the amber bottle went with it. The first night I laid in that bed until 3 in the morning with my heart going like a bird in a box. Second night was worse. I got the sweats. My hands wouldn't hold still. Around 4, I honestly thought, well, this is it. This is the stroke. Third night, I slept 4 hours. And I woke up at 10 after 6 in the morning. 10 after 6. I hadn't seen a 6 a.m. since Nathan was in high school. And the light coming through that window was sharp. That's the only word I've got. It had edges. I laid there and I heard a truck out on Route 9, and I knew it was a truck, and I knew it was Route 9, and I knew it was Saturday. I got up and went to the kitchen. And I looked out the window over the sink at that bird feeder. It was empty, bone dry, cobwebs in the corner of it. I don't know how long it had been like that. That's what I'm telling you. I looked at that thing every single day for a year, and I never once saw it. So I went out in my robe and I filled it, and that was the first thing I had done with my own 2 hands, on my own idea, in I couldn't tell you how long. Then I came back in, and I wanted to write something on the calendar. Anything, just to prove I'd been there that day. So I opened the junk drawer looking for a pen, and there was an envelope in there, electric bill, 2018. And on the back of it, in blue ballpoint, In handwriting, I would know in the dark, at the bottom of the ocean, 100 years from now, milk, coffee. The good bread, not the cheap kind. Raise Advil. Call Nathan about the gutters. Raise Advil. I sat down on that kitchen floor with my back against the dishwasher, and I held a grocery list from 7 years ago, and I cried the way a man cries when nobody's home. Ugly. Out loud. With my mouth open. And when I finally quit, I was awake. I don't mean rested, I mean awake, for the first time in 2 years. Around 11 that morning, the house phone rang. The landline. Nobody calls a landline but the pharmacy and a scam. I picked it up, and it was one of those recordings. Real pleasant lady. She said, "This is an automated message for Corinne Callahan. Your refill is ready for pickup." And then she said the name of it. I made her say it 3 times. Then I turned that envelope over, and underneath my dead wife's grocery list, in my own handwriting, I wrote down a word I couldn't pronounce. That afternoon, I did something a man my age doesn't do. I walked to the Marlow Public Library, 2.5 miles, because I didn't drive anymore. And because I was not about to look that word up on the phone that was on her plan, I sat down at one of those computers with a teenager on one side of me and a little kid playing a game on the other, and I typed it in with 2 fingers. It's not a sleep aid, it's a benzodiazepine. They give it for seizures, for panic, for a couple of weeks maybe, not 2 years, never 2 years. And then I scrolled down, and there was a line on that screen. I could draw you the shape of it, a line about older adults, long-term use, memory loss, confusion, cognitive impairment. And then it said, and I'm going to say it exactly the way I read it, sitting in a public library at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. In older adults, it can look like dementia. I wasn't sick. I was being fed. And here's the thing that just about finished me right there in that chair. I couldn't tell anybody. Think about who I was on paper that day. A 64-year-old widower who can't remember conversations, who missed his granddaughter's 6th birthday, who screamed at his son over a lockbox, who told his daughter, a nurse who'd offered to sit in the room with him, that her dead mother would be ashamed of her. And now that man walks into somewhere and says, "My wife is drugging me." You know what that sounds like? That sounds exactly like the disease. Paranoia. Delusion. Turning on your caregiver. She hadn't just taken my mind. She'd taken my voice. Every single thing I could say in my own defense was one more piece of evidence for her. She'd built a box with no door on it, and I was already inside. So I did the only thing I could do. Sunday night, she came home. Hugged me, asked if I'd been eating, and at 9 o'clock, there it was, little white pill, glass of water, and I picked it up, and I put it in my mouth, and I drank the whole glass and set it down. And I said, "Thank you, honey." Then I walked into the bathroom and shut the door and spit it into my hand. I've done some things in my life, built a company from a used van, raised 2 kids, carried my wife to the bathroom in the last week when she couldn't walk. But standing in that bathroom looking at a wet white pill in my palm, that is the first time in my whole life I ever felt like I was fighting somebody. I kept it. Went down in the basement and opened my old service toolbox, the red one. Callahan heating and air decal peeling off the lid. Hadn't been opened since 2018, and I dropped that pill in an empty Advil bottle, and the next night another one, and the next. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever had to pretend to be broken? Because that was my life for 6 weeks, and it is the hardest work I have ever done. I had to yawn at 9:15. I had to lay in that bed until 10:30 in the morning with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling sharp as a tack, listening to her make coffee downstairs. I had to lose my keys, on purpose. I had to walk into a room and stop and just stand there and let her find me and let her take my hand and let her say, "It's okay, honey, I'm right here. I'll remember for both of us." While I looked right at her and thought, "I've got you." I got so good at being sick that I scared myself. October. She had a standing hair appointment on Tuesdays, 10 o'clock, gone till about 12:30. One of those Tuesdays, I got the old photo box down out of the hall closet. The one Diane kept. 4th of July, 2022. The whole crowd out by the garage. I took that picture. And I had never once looked at it. I put my reading glasses on and I held it up to the window. Dale's hand was on her, not her shoulder, not a side hug. His hand was flat on the small of her back, low, fingers spread out, thumb hooked into her waistband like he owned the place. And her hand was behind her, 2 fingers through his belt loop, and both of them were smiling right into the camera, right at me. That is not a brother. I sat down on the floor of my own hallway with that photograph in my hand, and I turned my head. And I looked at the little white door under the stairs, the crawl space, where a blue plastic tote had been sitting for 4 years. Doyle's things. I'm not ready. The next Tuesday, I waited until 10:20. Then I got a flashlight, and I got down on my knees in front of that little door, and I opened it. The tote was right there. right where it went in. There was duct tape across the lid. I peeled it back slow so I could press it down again after, and I got my fingers under the edge, and I lifted. And the very first thing in that box, sitting right on top, sealed up in a sandwich bag, was a newspaper clipping. 400 words. My wife's obituary. The one I wrote. March 14th, 2019. Page 6 of the Marlow Beacon. Cut out clean with scissors. Not torn, cut. Squared up inside a sandwich bag like something a person means to keep. Diane died on the 9th. The notice ran on the 14th. I met Corinne on the second Wednesday of October. 7 months. She'd had my wife folded up in a plastic bag for 7 months before she ever sat down next to me in that basement. And I want to tell you I understood it right then, kneeling on the crawl space floor with a flashlight in my teeth. I didn't. My hands understood it. My hands started shaking so bad I had to set that bag down on the concrete. Because a woman doesn't clip a stranger's obituary, she clips a job posting. Under it was a manila folder, soft at the corners, the way paper gets when it's been handled for years. Obituaries, 30 of them maybe. The Zanesville Times Recorder, the Newark Advocate, the Coshocton Tribune, the Beacon, all women, and every last one of them ended the same way. She is survived by her husband of 31 years, 38 years, 44 years. She wasn't reading about the dead. She was reading about the man left standing at the graveside. And there were notes in the margins. Little ones, blue ballpoint, no kids in state, sold Beckman Trucking, 2016. Church, every Sunday. Too young, 2 daughters. No. Diane's had a check mark. Then I found the notebook. 99-cent spiral. The kind they stacked by the register in August. Page 1 had my name across the top in block letters. Ray Callahan. Underlined twice. Obit isn't the funeral homes. He wrote it himself. Reads like a man who never learned to say any of it out loud. Callahan Heating and Air, sold, 2018. Regional buyer, cash, house, paid off. Kettle Lake, 1994. The kids love it. This is the one he'll fight for. Nathan, 32, protective. Slow burn, easy. Aaron, 30, RN, problem. And then, further down the page, in a different pen, black instead of blue, Walt Deacon, retired LEO, problem, handle first. That's how I knew which parts came before. The blue she got out of a newspaper. Names, ages, the grandkids, the whole family tree printed under my dead wife's picture for $11. The black she got from me. At the bottom of that tote, under a folded sweater that still smelled like her, there was a brown accordion file, and inside it was a marriage license. Owen County, Kentucky, June 6, 1998. Corinne Marie Voss and Dale Allen Ranney. I sat back on my heels in the dark under my own stairs, and I said it out loud to nobody. Ranney. And then the whole ceiling came down on me at once. Doyle Ranney, not her husband. Her brother-in-law, Dale's brother, a real man who really died in December of 2011, who really left behind a wife named Sheila. She didn't invent a dead husband. She borrowed one. Because you cannot fake grief in a room full of people who have the real thing. They'll smell it on you in 10 minutes. But you can rent somebody else's. She had a real name, a real date, a real hospital, a real funeral home, a real casket she could describe if anybody pushed. Everything she needed to sit in the basement of St. Brendan's on a Wednesday night and pass. And Walt had it. 3 years ago, that man had every single piece of it in his hand. He searched Corinne and Doyle. He never once thought to search Corinne and Ranney. And I told him he couldn't stand to see me happy. There was no divorce decree in that box. I went through every page twice. And it turned out there wasn't one anywhere else either. But that took a professional 4 days and $110 to prove, and I'm getting ahead of myself again. It was 11:50. She'd be back at 12:30. Diane's old camera was in the photo box in the hall closet. Little silver thing, dead as a hammer. I tore that house apart looking for the charger and found it in a coffee can in the garage, and I plugged it in, and I stood there watching a red light with my heart going like a jackhammer. 20 minutes. Then I shot every page in that box, every obituary. Every line of that notebook, the license front and back, 81 pictures. Then I folded the sweater the way she folded it, set the tote back on its own mark in the dust, pressed that duct tape down with my thumb. At 12:29, I was in the recliner with the TV on, looking at nothing, exactly the way she left me. She came in, kissed the top of my head, and said, "Miss me?" And I said, Let me stop right here because I need a breath, and I'd bet you do too. If you're still with me, subscribe, leave a like, and flip that bell on so the next one finds you on its own. All right. 11 days later, a Thursday night in November. I was laying in that bed doing what I did every night now, pretending, eyes shut, breathing slow and stupid. And at about 20 after 1, the mattress moved. She got up. She didn't tiptoe. Why would she? The man in that bed had been unconscious by 9:15 every night for 2 solid years. I heard her on the stairs. I gave it 4 minutes by the clock. Then I got up. I laid that hallway floor myself in 96. Every board. I know the 2 that talk. I went down the middle of it barefoot and put my back flat against the wall by the dining room. And around the corner, under the sunroom door, there was a wedge of light on the wood. And my wife was laughing. No, because he's not going to remember it. That's the whole Dale, stop. That laugh. He still cries in the shower. Honestly, it's the easiest money we've ever made. Then a pause. Boyd's got the paperwork. It's done. It's been done since 23. It's immediate. I don't need a letter to touch the accounts. I've been in the accounts for 2 years. I need the letter for the placement. Another pause. Cedar Hollow. They've got a bed after the first of the year. 9 for a month, and it comes straight out of his own money, so who exactly is going to complain? Prewitt'll sign it. Prewitt hasn't looked at that man since 24. The Lake Place is quiet listed already. Corbyn's got a couple out of Dublin, but we do not touch the house. The second that house goes on the market, the daughter comes back, and the daughter's the only one in that family with a working brain. Then she went quiet for a long moment, listening to him, and when she spoke again, her voice went soft, almost fond. You know what actually did it? He wrote her obituary himself. I put my hand on the wall. 400 words, Dale. 400 words, and I knew everything about him. What scared him. What he'd never say out loud. Exactly where he'd break. A little laugh. Men like that write it all down one time in their whole life, and then they never say it again. And he handed it to a newspaper for $11. I stood in the dark in my own house, and I understood something I would give anything to understand. I sat at a kitchen table at 3 o'clock in the morning with a legal pad, and I bled onto that page trying to fit 34 years into 400 words. It was the last thing I ever made for my wife, and a stranger read it like a resume. Okay, she said. Okay. I'm going up. Then, love you too. And the light went off, and I couldn't move. I want you to understand that 30 seconds of that woman's voice took my legs out from under me in a hallway I built. She came through that door and about walked into me, and she made a sound. A real one. A scared one. The only honest thing I ever heard out of her. And she reached over and hit the hall light. And there I was, 64 years old, barefoot, in a t-shirt, standing in the middle of my own house at 1:40 in the morning. And she looked right at me. And I had about 1 second to decide whether the rest of my life was going to happen. So I let my mouth come open a little. And I looked past her, at nothing, the way I'd been practicing for 6 weeks. And I said, Diane? Is the water still running? And I watched every muscle in that woman's body let go. She took my hand. God, she was gentle. She said, oh, honey, no, sweetheart, it's Corinne. Come on, come to bed. And halfway up the stairs, she said it, right on cue. It's okay, I'm right here. I'll remember for both of us. And I let her put me in that bed. And I laid there and listened to her breathing go slow and easy beside me, and I stared at that ceiling until the window turned gray. And somewhere around 6 o'clock in the morning, I knew exactly who I had to call. A man I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, and the last thing I ever said to him was that he couldn't stand to see me happy. Tuesday, 10:15 in the morning. I put on a coat and I walked out my own front door, 3 miles, across town, out to Ostrander Road in November, in Ohio. Took me an hour and 10 minutes. My hip was screaming by the second mile, and I didn't care even a little bit. His garage door was up. He had a carburetor apart on a piece of cardboard, and about 9 small parts laid out in a row the way he does. I had 400 words ready. I'd been writing them in my head the whole way there. I got out maybe 6. He looked up, he said, Ray. And he set the wrench down, and he said, you want coffee? 3 years. 3 years, and the man asked me if I wanted coffee. I said, Walt, I need to say something to you. And he said, no, you don't. And that was the end of it. That was the whole reconciliation. I've known that man since we were 19 years old, and neither one of us has ever gotten a full sentence out about anything that mattered. So I stood in his garage and I said, her name is Ranny. And I watched Walt Deacon go absolutely still. I put Diane's camera on his workbench. He got his laptop and he pulled those 81 pictures up one at a time, and he went through every single one of them, blew them up, leaned in. Didn't say one word for 40 minutes, just his jaw working. Then he closed the laptop halfway and he said, Ray, sit down. There was a milk crate. I sat on it, and he said, you don't have a bad marriage. You've got a crime scene. And I need you to hear the next part because you're not going to like it, he said. Right now, today, you can't prove one single thing you just told me. I started to argue, and he put his hand up. The tote proves a woman reads obituaries. That's strange. That's not illegal. The notebook? A diary. The pills? They're hers, Ray. Her name's on the bottle, and you've got 40 of them in a coffee can in your basement. Which, by the way, makes you the one holding somebody else's controlled substance. Walt, the power of attorney is signed. By you. In front of a licensed attorney at your own kitchen table in your own handwriting. That document is clean. It's valid on its face, and there's not a judge in this state who'd look twice at it. And then, he said, the thing that took the air out of me. He said, you walk into the sheriff's office today and tell them your wife is poisoning you. You know what happens? They're kind about it. They sit you down, they get you a water, and then they call your emergency contact. He let that sit. Guess who that is? I looked at that concrete floor for a long time. Then I said, so what do I do? And Walt Deacon looked me right in the eye and said, you go home. And tonight at 9 o'clock, you take your pill. All right, quit breath. If you want to be here when the next one of these goes up, do me a favor, subscribe, hit that like button, tap the bell, costs you nothing. Now let me tell you what 4 days and $110 bought me. Walt still knew people. 30 years of knowing people doesn't just evaporate because you retired to fix lawnmowers for free. He called a records researcher out of Columbus, woman who does nothing but pull court files for a living. 4 days, $110. There is no divorce. Not in Ohio, not in Kentucky. Not in Indiana, not in Tennessee, not anywhere she could find with a keyboard and a phone. Corinne Marie Voss has been legally married to Dale Allen Ranney since the 6th of June, 1998. Walt also put me on the phone with a lawyer, not Boyd. A woman named Regina Stack. Elder law, downtown Columbus, no nonsense. Sounded like she'd heard about 900 of these. And she said, Mr. Callahan, I want to be very careful how I put this. She said, you're not married. You never were. That ceremony in your backyard was legally nothing. Which is the good news. She has no spousal claim on your house, your money, or one nail in that cabin. And I said, so it's over. And she said, no, because she doesn't need to be your wife. She's got something better. She's got your signature. And then she laid it out flat. She said, revoke that power of attorney on a Monday, and by Monday afternoon, every account you have is empty and she's across a state line. By Tuesday, you're a confused 64-year-old man making wild accusations about the woman who's been caring for him for 4 years, and she has a physician who'll say you're impaired, and a son you screamed at, and a daughter you threw out of your driveway. Mr. Callahan, on paper right now? She wins. She wins easily. I said, then what do I need? And she said one word. Her. Ohio's a one-party state. Walt explained it to me like I was a rookie, which I was. He said, you can't record her in Dale. That's a wiretap. And that'd sink us and put you in a courtroom on the wrong side. But you can record Ray Callahan having a conversation, any conversation, all day long, every day, and it's clean. I said, Walt, she's never going to say it to my face. 4 years. She's never slipped once. And he said, she's going to want to tell you. I said, why in God's name would she? And Walt said, because she's been brilliant for 4 years with nobody to show it to. That's a long time, Ray. And because in 6 weeks you're going to be a man who can't finish a sentence, in a room with a keypad on the door. He said, who exactly are you going to tell? I sat with that. And then Walt opened the laptop back up and said, there's one more thing. And I want you sitting down for this one, too. He'd found Sheila Ranney, Doyle's actual widow, 15 years out, lives up in Zanesville, works the desk at a dentist's office. Walt got her on the phone and handed it to me. She was cold at first. Careful. I told her who I was, and I told her I was married to a woman named Corinne, and she cut me off. She said, how long? I said, 4 years. And that phone went quiet for about 8 seconds. Then she said, Mister, you're not the first one. And that's when Walt turned the laptop around. He'd gone back through all 81 pictures on a real screen, blown up, and in that folder of obituaries, the one I'd flipped through on my knees with a flashlight in my teeth, there was a second check mark. I'd missed it. Of course I missed it. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the camera. Loretta Mears, the Coshocton Tribune, 2016, 59 years old, survived by her husband of 41 years, Gerald. Gerald Mears sold a paving company in 2014. Gerald Mears has been at a memory care facility in Zanesville since March of 2019. And Walt said, Ray, I've got the admission date. He said March 11th. My wife died on the 9th. You understand what I'm telling you? She locked the door on one man on a Monday. And on Thursday, she cut Diane's obituary out of the paper with a pair of scissors and squared it up in a sandwich bag. 2 days. That woman went 2 days between us, and something happened to me in that garage. I want to be honest about it. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even really anger, not the hot kind. It was quiet. It was the quietest I've felt since I was 58 years old. Because I finally knew what she was. She wasn't a wife who got greedy. She wasn't a woman who fell out of love. She was a trade. She and Dale had a trade, and they'd been working it for years, and I was just the next job on the list. And a job has a finish line. That was the whole thing. That's what I'd been missing. She was almost done. She was 6 weeks out. And a person that close to the end of a 4-year job gets comfortable. So I walked home, 3 miles back. And I laid in that bed and stared at the ceiling, and I thought about the one thing in my whole life she'd been circling since the day she met me. The one thing her own notebook said I'd fight for. The one thing she'd never gotten me to sign. And on the second Tuesday of December, I sat down across from her at my kitchen table with a pen in my hand and a $30 voice recorder in my shirt pocket, and I told my wife I wanted to give her the lake. She didn't take it. 4 years, and that woman never once grouted anything. That's what made her good. She looked at the pen in my hand, and she got that little crease between her eyebrows, and she said, "Honey, no, that's Nathan's. That's the kid's place." And I said, "The kids don't call." And she reached over and put her hand on my wrist, warm, soft, the same hand that rubbed my shoulder when I walked past the recliner. And she said, "Give it time, Ray." So I sat there, 64 years old, fog on my face. Mouth a little open, the way I'd been practicing since October, and I said, "You were right about them." "Nothing. You were right from the start," I said, before I ever saw it, before anybody. And then I looked up at her, right at her, and I said, "How did you know?" "You sat down next to me in that basement, and you already knew." And the kitchen got very, very quiet. She was watching my face, reading it. 4 years of work sitting in a chair across from me, and she was checking the seams one last time. So I gave her what she needed. I let my eyes drift off toward the window, at the bird feeder, at nothing, and I said, "I'm sorry. What were we talking about?" And I heard her breathe out, and she laughed, not the sunroom laugh, something smaller, almost sad. She said, "Oh, Ray." Then she got up and poured herself a cup of coffee, took her time about it, the way you do when you've decided something. And she leaned back against my counter and looked at me like a woman looking at a picture on a wall. And she said, "Do you really want to know?" I said, "Yeah." And she told me. She told me for 11 minutes. 11 minutes, 40 seconds, and I've heard it more times than any man should have to. She said, "Page 6, The Beacon, 14th of March. Like she was reading it off the ceiling. She said she'd been doing it for years, that most of them are written by the funeral home, and you can spot those in a line and a half, and every so often, every couple years maybe, you find one, a man wrote himself. She said, "Those are the ones." A man who writes it himself is a man who's never said any of it out loud to a living soul. And a man like that will hand it to a total stranger, and she'll just sit there and not tell him it gets better. She said the ice scraper was hers. She'd taken it out of her own glove box and put it in her trunk before she ever walked in that door. She said, "And you gave me yours." And I knew right then. I said, "The pills." And she said, I want you to hear how gently she said it. She said, "Sweetheart, you were not sleeping. You were tearing yourself apart in that bed every night. Nobody made you take it." Then she said, "And then you just kept taking it." I said, "Cedar Hollow." And she went still for about a second and a half. And then she smiled, and she said, "You do hear things, don't you?" And then she said the thing that I still, to this day, cannot get out of my head. She set that coffee cup down and she said, "Ray, it's a good place. You'll have a window. You'll have people. You'll have a garden out there with a path in it. And honey, you won't know the difference. I promise you won't know the difference." I said, "Is Dale your brother?" And my wife of 4 years looked me right in the eye and laughed and said, "No, honey, he's not." Then she came over, and she kissed the top of my head, and she said, "It's okay, I'm right here. I'll remember for both of us." And she took the pen out of my hand and put it back in the drawer. I sat at that table for about 4 minutes after she went upstairs. Then I got my coat, and I walked out my own front door, and I went 3 miles to Ostrander Road in the cold with a $30 recorder in my shirt pocket. Walt put one earbud in. He sat on that milk crate for 11 minutes and 40 seconds and didn't move. Then he took it out, and he set it down on the workbench, and he put both hands flat on either side of it and looked at that little plastic thing for a long time. And Walt Deacon, 30 years, never rattled, never raised his voice. Walt said, "Ray." I need a minute. And he walked out of his own garage into the driveway and stood there in the cold with his back to me. I don't know what he was doing out there, I've got to guess. I stayed in that house for 19 more days. 19. Christmas and everything. Because Regina Stack said the prosecutor needed the accounts pulled first, and the Kentucky license certified, and the Mears file walked over to a second county, and none of that happens fast, and the second I moved out, that money was gone, and Corinne Voss was 3 states away. So I ate her casseroles. I let her cut the crusts off. I let her put her hand on my chest. On Christmas Eve, she gave me a flannel shirt, and I said thank you, and I meant it out loud in my kitchen, and I hated myself. And every night, at 9 o'clock, she set a little white pill on the counter next to a glass of water. And every night, I looked her in the eye and said thank you, honey. 48 more of them went in that Advil bottle in the red toolbox. They came on the 6th of January. 10:40 in the morning. 2 cars, no lights, she was in the sunroom, and here's the only part of this whole thing I couldn't watch. I sat in the recliner and looked out at that bird feeder while a deputy read her rights to her in my house. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't say one word. But she looked at me on her way past that chair. I could feel it on the side of my face like a heat lamp, and I know exactly what she was doing. She was still checking the seams. She went out that door thinking she'd been unlucky. Dale lasted 11 days before he started talking. Big guy. Easy handshake. Laughed at everything I said. He gave them Gerald Mears in about 40 minutes, and he gave them the accounts, and he gave them her. And he did it so fast that Regina Stack said she'd rarely seen a man that eager to be first in line. Corinne never took a deal. She sat in that room and told them she'd been a caregiver, and that her husband was a sick man, and that the family had always resented her. Then they played 11 minutes and 40 seconds for her. She pled out in April. Bigamy. Theft from an elderly person. 2 counts of unlawful administration of a drug. And a couple of things with long, ugly names that added up to a number I don't need to say out loud, except this. She is 57, and she will not be a free woman until she is well past the age I am right now. She never got $1 of the lake. She never got the house. That backyard wedding with 26 people in it was, legally, a barbecue. Curtis Boyd wasn't charged. I told you I didn't think he knew, and I still don't. But I hear he doesn't do family trusts anymore. Dr. Prewitt got a letter from the state medical board. I don't know what came of it, and I've decided I don't want to. And Gerald Mears, Zanesville. 7 years in a room with the keypad on the door. They took him off what they had him on, and about 4 months later, that man could hold a conversation. Not all of it came back. It doesn't. He's with his son in Michigan now, and I'm told he gets tired, and he loses the thread, and some days are just gone. But he knows his son's name. I sat with him one afternoon last fall. Neither of us said much. 2 old men on a porch who both know exactly what it's like to have somebody stand over you and say it's okay, I'll remember for both of us. Now, the hard part. I couldn't call my kids. Not for 19 days. Not while it was live. So Erin found out from a deputy. She was in my driveway in 40 minutes, still in her scrubs, ran across that gravel, and I got the door open, and I had it all ready, every word, 4 years of it, and I got about 2 sounds out. And my daughter said, don't. And she put her head on my chest and she said, I knew. Dad, I knew, and I let you send me away. And I stood there in the cold, holding a 35-year-old woman like she was 6, and I want you to understand that was the worst part. Not the pills, not the sunroom, that. Because she'd been carrying it, she thought it was hers. Nathan was slower. Nathan's like me, God help him. He came around 3 weeks later and stood in my kitchen with his coat still on and wouldn't sit down. And finally he said, you told me I couldn't wait for you to die. And I said, I know. And he said, I need you to know that I heard that. Every day. For 2 years. And I said, I know, son. That's all either of us could do. We're not built for the other thing. But he sat down. First Saturday in May, we opened up Kettle Lake. Nobody called anybody. Nobody planned it. You just go. Nathan cut that lockbox off with a bolt cutter and threw it in the truck. Cole is 13 now and taller than me. Maddie made me hold a wet frog for 11 minutes. Erin burned the burgers, same as her mother. And Walt sat on my dock in a folding chair. And I finally got it out. I'd been carrying it for 3 years, and I finally said, Walt, I'm sorry. And he looked out at that water for a second, and he said, you want a beer? That envelope's still in the junk drawer. Milk, coffee, the good bread, Ray's Advil, call Nathan about the gutters. I don't frame it. I don't move it. It's where she left it. The bird feeder's full. And here's the last thing. Corinne read 400 words about my wife and thought she'd found the map to me. She got the business, the cabin, the kids, all of it. but she skipped the last line. Because the last line wasn't about the money and it wasn't about the grief, and I only wrote it because it was true. I wrote, she always knew when somebody was lying. She'd just wait. That woman read my wife's obituary like a resume. She should have read it like a warning. If this one stayed with you, and you want more true-to-life stories of secrets, betrayal, and the justice that finally lands, tap the video on your screen now. I'll be right there waiting for you.